what I find, I find as I have grown older and become more mature, I have gravitated towards the older, more orthodox style of masculinity,
Mm.
like more towards stoicism, more towards, like in episode 28, I think you and Ollie talked about depression and anxiety. And one of the things you had mentioned was like, for me, it's like, okay, as long as I have like mild, medium depression, I'm just gonna suck it up and deal with it. And then once it comes to a point where I can no longer live life, like I can finally acknowledge it, right?
Mm.
So I really resonate with that. Now I'm not saying that's the right way to do
It's
it,
not
but
not the
that
best
is
approach, but
like,
that's how it is. Yeah.
yeah, that's how it is, right? And now that's like one negative aspect of this version of masculinity. What are some positive aspects? Make shit happen,
Mm.
like competition, domination in terms of like in terms of competition, actually, you go in, you're like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to dominate my opponents or whatever, right? Coming
Mm.
out on top, making shit happen, being the quote unquote man. And I don't even know if that's like politically correct to say anymore. But anyways, being aggressive, competitive,
Mm.
the will to win, the drive, the ambition, the desire to like just grab your opponent and tear them apart. Not literally, but you know what I'm saying, right? Uh, I find that these traits are heavily disincentivized in society today,
Yeah.
but at the same time, simultaneously revered, right? Like, do you really think someone like Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and even like firefighters, soldiers, like, do you really think these guys are going out, okay, if my opponent, as a soldier, if my opponent doesn't want to sit and talk about it over a tea party, I'll shoot the fucking guy, right?
Mm.
Like, no, they're going out, we're gonna kill. So these people are respected, but at the same time, these masculine traits are, well, labeled as toxic, right? So
Yeah.
the conclusion that I draw from this, it's like the evolution of the Industrial Revolution and the civilizing of man. Now it's like the castration of man,
Mm.
like completely remove all any forms of ambition and drive and whatnot. But when push comes to shove, let's say you're the traditional, by traditional I mean stereotypical guy who gets married, has two kids, a car, a white picket fence, a fucking dog, and then for some reason your wife cheats and it's like it's your fault,
Mm.
right? It's like, but I did everything I was supposed to do. Did everything right. I got the job. I got everything. And it's like, oh, you're just not man enough.
Hmm.
Like that's usually what it is. You're boring or whatever the fuck it is, right? So the reason I bring this up is because instead of blaming people for not having the results in their that they want in their life, I do see it as how we were describing as the outcome of the current system that we have, right?
Mm.
And there are two ways we can deal with this. One is we can wait to have a system that facilitates us living an enriched, fulfilled life until YouTube gets its shit together and stops trying to harvest our time and attention, essentially. Uh, or we can take control of our lives now and make shit happen.
Mm.
Now, because these, sorry, last point, because these traits are labeled or are now being associated with a negative connotation, do you think this is, or how do you think this affects men's abilities to have that sort of positive drive and make shit happen sort of attitude when they're constantly told this is wrong?
Yeah. I definitely think we have a problem with this. Like, we don't have any good frameworks for people to be masculine in a healthy way. Um, and and unfortunately, it creates those extremes essentially, right? It's like either you try to be, and yeah, I think I think this is also something that I think most women are probably not aware of, how deep this kind of masculinity shaming goes. But I think it's parallel. It's like women are shamed for other stuff, and there's like this implicit stuff, that can run that can cut really deep. And I think we are pretty unaware of what those things are, what it's like for women, and they're unaware of
Yeah,
what it's like for us. But we basically don't have a healthy way of dealing with this. Um, and like you say, it's almost like our society is kind of schizophrenic about it, because on the one hand, there's a lot of shaming of and a lot of talk about toxic masculinity. But it's just because toxic masculinity exists doesn't mean that all masculinity is toxic, and that's kind of the message that goes lost. And there's very little in terms of like alternatives, you know. Well, okay, I'm not. There's a lot of messaging about don't this, don't that, don't, you know, all the stuff you're not supposed to do, all the stuff that's bad. But there's no offering of, well, do this instead, focus on this instead. No, it's just. And like you say, at the same time, of course, we revere the ultra masculine. We revere the go-getter athlete and the MMA fighter and the cutthroat CEO to some level, right? So yeah, I think this is, in terms of what to do about it. I mean, I think this is where, you know, we talked about the regrets of the dying in the last episode, and it's like, one of the regrets is one of the top regrets of the dying is I wish I hadn't lived my life for other people, or I wish I had lived for myself. So I think it's a very bad idea to just try to conform. Okay, so let me say that as my first recommendation. Don't conform. I think people tend to regret that. And so we have, let's say, the mainstream culture. And I think we should give very little energy to trying to conform to mainstream culture, and instead think about what is good for me, what is good for people close to me, what culture and tribe do I want to create. And yeah, that's like, for me, one of the ways I think about it is that, like, well, I try to be that role model for other people in my life. Okay, I try to offer an alternative that is neither toxically masculine, which, you know, all expressions of toxic masculinity come from weakness and fear. And I'm not a fan of being weak and fearful, right? So it's like, that's the reason I don't do that. It's not because someone wagged their finger at me and said, ooh, toxic masculinity, right? And I try to show, basically, I try to live by example, essentially, and I try to provide guidance where I say, look, this is Shane's version of how to be masculine in a way that is neither toxic nor castrated. And let me also say, I think a big problem is, like, when you were describing some of these masculine traits, I think a big problem is that we can't acknowledge the beauty in that. Because yes, of course, there's also like aggression and brutality in it sometimes, but there's something really beautiful about like a pure masculine expression. And it's something that we don't acknowledge and we don't celebrate. And I actually think the same is true for women. I think that we have, or femininity, we have very few ways in which to really like acknowledge and celebrate like the beauty of feminine expression. It's almost always weighed down with something, it's almost always like it's like, it always goes hand in hand with slut shaming and stuff like that, So I think in general, we're just, and again, this is human zoo stuff. I think we've just fucked ourselves up a little bit with how we treat like masculinity and femininity in general. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure what I can say here that's useful. I think that what's really good to explore is like fear. Okay, what behavior is driven by fear? Because like an authentic, pure expression is not going to be fear driven. And like I said, I think this is kind of the thing that distinguishes toxic masculinity. It's like overt aggression, punching down, threatening and bullying those who are smaller and weaker than you. Like, why would you do that if you weren't afraid? Someone who's not afraid has no desire to do that. Someone who's not afraid and isn't hurt has no desire to, bark loudly and thump their chest and bully others in an attempt to appear strong. Someone who knows that they're strong doesn't need to do that, obviously, right? So that is what I would look for, is like, look for areas in your life where you feel some kind of an urge to express, and ask yourself, Is there fear behind this or not? And if there's not fear behind this and it doesn't harm anyone, um, then it doesn't matter whether someone else thinks you ought to be like this or you ought to do like this. Then you should definitely go your own way in that sense.
Yeah, very good point. And I think I'd like to add to what you mentioned. Like when you're operating from fear, you're trying to push and bully people down. When you're operating from strength, you're trying to actively lift everyone around you, right?
Yeah.